corruption in Africa is a very big problem.
Corruption is a big problem in Africa.
Corruption is a very big problem in Africa.
Corruption is a big problem everywhere.
I don't think that any kind of politician can be trusted.
Corruption in Africa. Corruption in Africa.
Corruption in Africa. Corruption in Africa. Yeah. Do you want to sit at the window?
Yeah, please.
Not bad, eh?
Cool bananas. Yeah. Now that was cool. Bands,
Yeah,
the music,
the music.
the politics.
Let's not go there. The whole thing is to try and increase the amount of aid, debt relief, good governance, the corruption thing that they're going on and on and on and on and on about. If all you ever hear about Africa is that it's corrupt, what do you think people will start to think? Obviously,
Africa and Africans are corrupt.
yeah.
But it's so bad, that it becomes almost something, for lack of a better word, that becomes almost like a racist thing. Not in a black-white thing, but okay, African, corruption.
Yeah.
See an African driving a nice car, he must be corrupt.
Yeah, that's true.
See an
That's
African
true.
in a nice house, he must be corrupt.
That's true.
See an African opening a business,
Yeah.
well, where you from? Oh, Africa.
Yeah.
How'd you do that?
It's the whole white man's burden thing. You know, I was watching a very sickening documentary with Bob Geldof. He was in the Congo, he's on a UN boat, he's going down the river, and he's going on and on about these savages and crazy warlords who are out to get him, hanging around in the trees, and you couldn't see them.
Yeah,
you know.
yeah,
They weren't
obviously,
around at all.
yeah.
But he kept on talking about them as if they were coming out any minute. You know, we couldn't see any weapons, we couldn't see any threats
Apocalypse
whatsoever.
now.
You know,
In the
evil,
yeah.
just running around in the bushes. Oh, these
makes-
savages. It's just it's that kind of thing. It's just so sickening, you know. It is just he just went on and on and on about. I think there was even a line where he said, "This is evil." You know,
Well, yeah,
sort of thing.
obviously.
And I'm sure he felt like he was starting in some sort of Hollywood movie. But it's the whole thing about not having any evidence and just going on and on about it, about the evil, African evil.
He's in there.
Exactly.
And the warlords, and the guns. But I'm filming a movie. Coming down the river.
Yeah, and he was protected. In the UN boat, he's talking about, you know, the threat that's imminent, which is non-existent.
So, I've had enough of it.
I know. I'm sick to the point where I'm just like, something has to be done. You know, it has to stop now. Somebody somewhere needs to sit down and question what is being said. You can't just sit and talk about these things like it's
And accept it.
and just accept it when you don't even question it. You know, you don't even ask why are people saying this? Is it the case? Why are people talking about it all the time? What is the big problem? You know, nobody's doing it.
Can you get something?
Some coffee
Yeah, I'll have a Sprite.
and a Sprite as well.
Are they all there?
Yeah, got no ice cream. We didn't come down before the ice cream.
Okay, then I'm fine then.
Okay,
Yeah,
just
sure.
hot chocolate. Thank you.
There you go. I mean, I was watching a program on BBC 4 over the weekend. I can't remember what it was called, but the whole thing was like, what's wrong with Africa?
I mean, it's a name of a program. What's wrong with Africa?
No, I don't know that was the name of the show, but the basis of the show was what's wrong with Africa.
Sorry.
So they had this whole thing where they had like all these different speakers who were from Africa. They had one section on corruption. Obviously, duh. She started off by saying, so corruption's a big problem, you know. How do we tackle this issue? Not addressing whether or not corruption is a big issue.
It's a standard.
Yeah, it's
That's-
a standard. This woman who is a perpetual sort of prophet of doom for Africa, I would say.
All we ever gonna show is this dark, black, evil.
I promise you, after watching that thing, I was so depressed. I mean, as an African, I sat there, I'm like, maybe I should go and hang myself, you know.
and the rest.
And the round table.
Approach is quite coach. We ask you to respect fellow passengers by putting electric on silent and using mobiles in the vestibule lanes.
Did you remember to bring everything with you?
Yeah.
Extra batteries.
Can you get the mic?
Oh God. Oh.
Brenda.
Hi, Yolanda.
What we're going to do here is just cross over the Royal Mile, which goes from Holyrood Palace, just there, just at the bottom, and I suppose the castle on the mound. Well, now I've picked my right path back into the traffic again, perhaps you'd like to tell me a bit more about what you're doing here and where you're from.
Well, Brendan and I are from South Africa. Yeah, and we came up to the UK last year in March, just to travel and, you know, do some sightseeing and stuff. It's been good, eh, Brendan?
Yeah, it's been good.
So we just, at the moment we're living in London.
Yeah.
Working. And this is our first trip up to Edinburgh, so we're quite excited.
They've let you over the border, that's the important thing.
They have.
Tell me about this film you're making.
Basically, it's a film about investigating the perception that Africa as a continent is corrupt. Because when we first arrived here, and a lot of it's been happening quite recently now with the G8 summit and, you know, break poverty history and all that, we kept hearing all these sort of statements and stuff that, you know, people's perceptions mainly on Africa is that it's corrupt and that's why it's struggling to develop, and that was one of the main reasons. And through conversations with different people, you know.
Bridge of Allen. The situation keeps changing. As I've been saying, traffic very bad as a result of these closures. If you can, don't travel in the area.
What do you think about the whole corruption issue and how Africa's sort of been thrown into this corruption pool?
What do I think of it? Well, I kind of relate to it, the fact that I'm from America and that my president is held to be corrupt by most of the rest of the world. I imagine it's a really difficult position to be an African person right now when you're not, you know, within the government, because you don't feel like it necessarily is reflective of you, the corruption.
What is happening here today, though?
Well, not just here. Like I said, this camp's been set up quite a while ago, but it's been probably fully functioning for about a week at least. It's the name of it's really the Horizon site, and what the Horizon site means that it's an autonomous zone, so nobody's in charge. There is no leaders, shared by everybody. So we share the duties for the gates, we share the duties to sort out the toilet facilities, to sort out the recycling, the cooking, all the decision-making processes. Everyone has a go at everything if they want. It's not just a base camp for people who want to protest about the G8. It's also an example of an alternative to the way that many people are living in the world.
If you saw an African leader with a nice expensive Mercedes-Benz and he had a really, really big house, would that mean corruption to you, or?
I mean, I would think, you know, perhaps the money could have been better spent. It would depend on the African nation. If it was a rich one, then, you know, by all means, it's perfectly entitled to drive a car if he'd earned the money himself. However, if, you know, people were starving in the streets, that money probably could have been better used.
Okay. They've blocked most of the main roads and the highway. Do you think we should go to Edinburgh or Stirling or what?
Kim, how far are we from Stirling? Do you think Stirling's a good idea?
We can try Stirling. We're about 30 miles from Stirling and about 50 miles from Edinburgh.
Let's try Stirling then. I'm sure there'll be lots of protesters there as it is. I'm sure they've got more police out than actual protesters. We thought that there were going to be loads of people here, and there's not really.
They're all
loads of
spread
people
out.
Here, so
They're all spread out. They're all over the place.
Do you think there'll be lots of people in Edinburgh, maybe?
Yeah.
The Geldof saying something like he wanted 1 million people or something to rock up at Edinburgh, and then there was supposed to be 5,000 people, and we can't find them. So, I don't know. So it's like almost 500 people here, maybe. Huh?
It's a big difference between 500 and 5,000.
Yeah, definitely. Mind behind you. Go back. Okay, cool. Yeah, a very big difference. So the whole thing was a bit of a flop, actually. At least there's some people. Yeah. What are your views on Africa? Why do you think it's taking such a long time for it to develop?
I do believe that there's an awful lot of corruption going on out there within the governments, and I mean the aid money, I don't think all the aid money quite often gets through the help that they need. An awful lot of it does disappear, I think.
Why do you say that though? What makes you think that the leaders are corrupt?
It's gone blank.
It's okay. Is it based on something that you read, or
I do read,
like specific cases, or?
Well, I do follow quite a lot of stories like Sudan and Zimbabwe, and I've actually known people who've actually gone out there to work, and they've got first-hand stories about some of the corruption that goes on. So.
To work like as aid workers?
Yes, yes. They've set up like projects to help people out there.
Okay. So, what kind of corruption was it that they were talking about? What kind of incidences can you think of that happened?
I read all this stuff, I can't think of it.
Well, I guess I have a friend from South Africa.
Yeah.
I was talking to her mom. She said that the crime rate there is really high because all the poverty-stricken people from, northern Africa and stuff are going down there because that's the better part of Africa.
Right.
Yeah, and the crime rate over there is really high. And
okay, because I'm actually from South Africa.
Oh, are you?
Yeah, the crime rate isn't that high.
Really?
No.
Oh wow, because she says her aunts and uncles have been hijacked and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, and these are wealthy parts, I don't know. That's what she said.
That's very interesting. Because the thing is, when we came over here as well, there was a whole lot of talk about where we coming from being quite corrupt, being very full of crime. And I've lived in Johannesburg and driven through the most dangerous parts of the country and stuff. And it's not that bad. It's the same as London or anywhere else where you go to, and something could happen to you. It just depends on the time and the place that you are. Yeah. What do you think about corruption in Africa?
I think corruption in Africa, it's getting worse. You see it a lot on the news recently. It's all coming out nowadays. I think you're just starting to notice it a lot more.
Do you think it's a big issue?
I think it's becoming a major issue.
What makes you say that? What makes you think that?
Just because I've never ever really heard of it that much before, but then now it's all over the news a lot of the time. Corruption in Africa, it's all on all the time.
Do you think it's true?
A lot of it's just rumours and stuff, but a lot of it is true as well. They get given grants to do up the town, and then a royal palace gets built.
Yeah, but you're saying this though. Is there a specific country that you can think of where this has happened?
But just throughout the news, but I've saw it
Do you think that African politicians can be trusted?
No, I don't think they can, but I don't think European politicians or American politicians can be trusted either. I teach a class in Hackney, and one of my students was Mobutu's personal chauffeur, and he was explaining the wars in Congo, Zaire, and Angola, and basically CIA backing the diamond where the diamonds were and the rebels, and also backing the government where the petrol's at. So actually, they're playing both sides, causing wars. And that whole Kabila, he was explaining the whole situation, and
so
basically vested interests. So
what is your understanding then about the corruption situation in Africa? What do you understand by that?
It's all vested interests. There's Europeans, it's business what they're doing with the Mugabes, the Mois, and all the bad, the dictators.
What this does is that it's obvious that poverty breeds corruption because of the nature of the kind of people that get in power there. But what this is about is that if enough eyes and if enough pressure and if enough people are interested in places like Zimbabwe, you'd hope that this event has made so many more people interested in that. You look at the papers; it is getting the front headlines. People are more interested.
But what is getting the front headlines? Corruption issues getting the front headlines.
We've got no mandate to say that we're corrupt. The whole Liverpool scandal, they just threw money at FIFA to get
But they
through.
don't say Liverpool is it up. They say scandal or something.
The corruption is just as bad here, really.
What do you say?
I say that, the reason, it seems obvious to me that we live in a very different society than somewhere like Zimbabwe, and you can talk about Tony Blair, and there's so many posters of Tony Blair and the evil and stuff, and I think it's all got mixed up. Somewhere like Zimbabwe, there's a very, very clear, very corrupt kind of leader in position, which is much more clear for me than someone like Tony Blair or George Bush, if you ask me.
How is it more clear though? Is it just because it's said explicitly in the newspapers that
he controls the media.
is?
One, he controls the media. That's a very, very big point for me. We can read a lot.
Who controls the media? Yeah.
Why aren't other African leaders like condemning? Why is Mbeki like not condemning Mugabe? And
listen, what I'm saying is that corruption has been made a big issue by the West, so that we can introduce all these sort of conditionalities and all these sort of issues and ways and behavioural change, so that the West can be in control. That's what I'm saying.
But there's one statistic I heard. One African country.
From who?
Well, it was. I'm not going to mention the African country, but it was broadsheet, and it was saying 200 billion has.
Yeah, and Bob Geldof said there was 5 billion viewers watching the live aid concert. That wasn't true, though.
Folks, stop moving back, please.
It's like herding sheep, isn't it? Can we sneak through here?
I don't think so.
We can try. There were so many cops there. And there were even more photographers. Did you see? Hey, isn't that Edinburgh Castle?
Yeah. That's where the Queen hangs out when she comes to Scotland.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and it costs like thousands to put her up here just for like a day or a night.
My word.
And if that was a leader or politician or king in Africa, the automatic assumption would be that they were corrupt.
Yeah.
But it doesn't happen here though.
No. And look how far along it spans over to that side as well.
Yeah, it's like the size of a suburb.
I know.
I think corruption is a major problem. It is costing Africa about $150 billion a year, which is 6 times the total aid budget each year.
Okay, what makes you think that is true though?
Well, just a lot of it, like you see them driving around their Rolls-Royces and everything, when stuff like that, when they're meant to be getting money to do stuff.
Yeah, but the Queen drives around in a Rolls-Royce. What's different with that?
Don't know.
Hey?
Don't know.
Wax on. Wax on.
Not so bad.
I want to start with asking a very simple question. Why are some countries rich and some poor? The governments of poor places chose poverty. Why did they choose it? They chose it because they prefer other things. Power, corruption, patronage, whatever it might be. but nonetheless, poverty is the trade-off they chose.
My name is Yolanda Mufeba. I'm from South Africa, coincidentally as well. I just wanted to talk to you about corruption. There's been a lot of media hype and stuff, obviously with the Make Poverty History and the G8 Summit in the papers in England, specifically about that topic. I wanted to find out what your views were on good governments and things like corruption coming from Africa, and whether you think that's such a big issue or not.
Well, Yolanda, if I can just say something, share something with a compatriot here. Corruption in Africa and the third world is because there is discretionary power in the hands of officials who arbitrarily dish out favors, permits, import permits, government contracts, licenses, whatever it might be, to friends, relatives, people who support the party and so on. And what we need is, again, what the G8 have. Objective rules under the rule of law, where corruption is very difficult, and when it occurs, it's actually easily exposed.
Let's say last 50 years, if you look at the amount of aid in today's dollars Africa has received, it's $2.3 trillion. People talk about a Marshall Plan for Africa. There has been a Marshall Plan for Africa. In fact, there's been no other part of the world where there's been this sort of money going to it. And what has happened to it? Is there any development there? No. What has happened to it? It's all been stolen. Why? Because the tragedy of Africa are the predatory elites which took over when at the end of the colonial empires. So there's an endemic problem. I mean, it's an endemic problem, endemic problem, endemic problem, endemic problem.
We are now currently facing what we call in Russia the Venezuelan disease, when the seductive inflow of money corrupts the system to the extent that macroeconomic processes get distorted and growth is falling.
And of course, the other problem is about corruption. Because if Africa is poor, and you're getting money from outside, and people are stealing this money, I think the logical conclusion here would be that whoever is giving us the money is also the agent of corruption.
My question is, what's it going to take to get massive investment in third world? For example, my country is Eritrea, relatively small and very small economy as well, and it's a very new country, and there's no foreign investment at all. So, yeah, what's it going to take, and what do you think the obstacles are?
I'm going to give you a very simple answer, which is not simple later to get implemented. By the simple answer is, you need to make sure that you're not going to steal the money of the people who will go to invest, that you're not going to expropriate the property of those who will be going there to put the money.
Merchandise.
blacks make wonderful rocks. Thank you, Mom. Like the wonderful.
So, how did you find the summit?
Oh my word, is it really that bad? I mean, does everybody think that corruption is such a big problem in Africa?
Well, these are the free marketeers, and I mean, if they were speaking about aid causing corruption and they can't invest in African countries because of the level of corruption.
Yeah, but every single speaker that was saying that corruption is a big problem and that aid causes corruption and that, you know, it's this whole sort of self-infesting problem that's just going to lead us to, like, you know, doom and gloom. And
What I can't for the life of me understand is that nobody sits down and says, is this thing real? People just assume,
yeah,
you say Africa corrupt, and that's the end of the story.
I know. Could you give us some background information on Transparency International?
Yes, Transparency International is an NGO that was established about 12 years ago in order to impact on the question of corruption on a global basis.
And how, for the purposes of this documentary, how would you define corruption?
In TI, we define corruption as the misuse of entrusted power for personal gain.
And has the Corruption Perception Index helped to determine what kinds of corruption or forms of corruption exist, or?
No, I think it's fairer to say that the Corruption Perception Index is really simply a guide to levels of corruption and a guide to where corruption is more or less endemic. So that if you have an index in which a country such as Nigeria several times appears at the bottom and a country such as Finland several times appears at the top, that's to say the least corrupt, then you can see the range of corruption. The research is no more than a poll of polls, so the results are averaged across what last year was about 120 countries.
So it's based on the opinions of business people and ordinary people alike on whether or not they perceive that country to be corrupt, or? Yeah,
the domestic opinion is provided by what Gallup opinion poll people call local informed opinion.
I see. And why is it based on opinion or perception as opposed to evidence?
Because it's extremely difficult. Nobody has yet found a method of assessing corruption in a systematic way that can be assessed across countries. We've balanced it, which I think relates to your question, by publishing a bribe payers index, which is an assessment of the propensity of exporting countries to pay a bribe. And it showed that China, for example, is the exporting country with the highest propensity to pay a bribe.
Following on that, how would you say the results of these surveys have impacted on the countries involved in the study?
They've been considered to be extremely dramatic from the point of view of the public vis-à-vis their own government. It's a kind of stick with which the public can beat its own government.
So you don't see this as another form of sort of Western intervention?
I think you're neglecting public opinion within Africa.
Surely it must have a negative impact on those countries who aren't, who are found to be perceived as corrupt, and therefore, you know, get excluded from receiving the relief that they need.
Well, that depends how you look at it. It's true that Kenya in the last year has been excluded from additional US aid because of its ranking on, not only on the TI Corruption Perception Index, but on other measures.
In view of that, what is Transparency International's approach to things like development then?
Well, I mean, everybody's in favor of development. I'm a development economist. So there are very few people in TI who are not in favor of a transfer of resources from the north to the south. But one has to recognize that this is corruption is a very serious problem. It's really very difficult to argue that corruption is not an impediment to development.
I mean, by focusing on corruption, does that not then hinder the process of development? The view that I'm getting as someone who's come to this country from Africa is that there's a general sort of cynicism or pessimistic attitude towards Africa. And there's Africa and corruption is always put in the same basket, which I think is something that is seriously, hammering Africa's reputation and their integrity. And I think somehow that has had a very big impact on how far Africa's getting in terms of global development.
Well, if it limits it in the sense that it restricts the total volume of funds that might be available, but it also puts pressures on government to introduce reforms, I would argue that's a pretty good move.
Is it not dangerous to go on public opinion and perception? I mean, I know there's a lot of pessimism within this country about the government itself. That might not necessarily mean that they are doing a bad job, or do you know what I mean? Like, people might think that crime in this country is extremely high, but the police might say that, crime statistics have gone down over the last year or so.
So the question of perception, you mean? Is perception inaccurate?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's a good way of putting it. I don't think that it is myself.
China's also had very little, Western intervention, other than things like trade and whatever.
Yeah.
And yet they've been able to develop, despite the view among the public that they seem to be corrupt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's true. I don't have an answer to that question.
It's okay.
I think corruption in Africa is a huge problem. I personally would love to go to Africa, possibly to live there, but I have a lot of friends from there and stuff who say that the corruption issue is so bad that they're obviously running away from it as well. And such a big country, and it's so full of wealth, and for it to be exploited and plundered like that is hurtful, because really and truly I should be able to go back there and set up, but I can't, because the corruption there is just, it's not worth it really.
Yeah, I believe corruption is a big problem in Africa.
Yes, I do think corruption is in Africa. When all the aid goes over, a lot of the government soldiers and everything stop it. People don't get fed. There's so many starving people and none of them are getting fed because all the government's taking it all.
I've heard about corruption in Africa, South Africa. However, I don't really know much about it. I believe it's a great problem with...
It's fine.
Everywhere, including South Africa.
Yeah, corruption in Africa is massive. It's big.
Money that is being given to that country is being siphoned off by people who are wanting to invest for their own selves.
There is the corruption that we have in the West and have always had of bits of nepotism and so on and so forth, but the job gets done in the end, and the job gets done reasonably, or there is the I'm going to pinch all the money and have a short-term outlook and just get the money and run away to Switzerland. And so the bad corruption is that, of the short-termism, absolute thieving, rather than the I'll take 5% and get the job done anyway.
How have you found people's views about Africa and things like that?
Still quite typecast, I think. You know, when I was growing up in South Africa, we were constantly told that, north of the border, the rest of Africa was always really corrupt.
Mm-hmm.
And, if it wasn't for the fact that white people ran South Africa would be just as miserable as the rest. And it did strike me that it was very convenient to say that, because clearly it was an apology for white supremacy and all the rest of it. And it's really shocking, though, that similar sentiments are here, because there's a strong feeling, I think, that African governments are inherently corrupt, that without any kind of external regulation, money that's given from the donor community is going to be siphoned off.
Yeah.
And if you want any real kind of development, very tough rules have to be applied from outside.
I mean, I found the same experience when we came over here. Bren and I, in speaking to our friends and watching the news and reading the newspapers, you sort of got the impression that they
is this perception that Africa is generally a basket case, and you know they need some help or some kind of intervention. It's depressing actually, you know, because you sit there and you know, I know that I come from South Africa. I've lived there. To come over here and having to defend what is good about the country to a vast amount of people. When Brendan and I went out on the streets filming people to find out what they thought about corruption in Africa, 100% of people said they definitely thought corruption was one of the biggest problems facing Africa at the moment. When we asked them why, or to back it up with any sort of evidence or anything, they struggled. They cited examples like Zimbabwe, for example.
And if you probe that further, it's really because of the political relationships that are going on. Britain has had a long-standing fight with the government of Zimbabwe, and no matter what we might or may not think of President Mugabe, I think the issue is who decides.
Yeah.
And surprisingly, you know, Zimbabweans have continued to vote for ZANU. Even if you allow for a certain margin of error of election rigging, there's still a fairly solid constituency behind the president. Now, it's not for us to make a judgment about that. It's all really about how seriously do you take the issue of democracy? Do you want people to form their own lives and their own governments?
Yeah, and just because you don't agree with it,
if
say
you
that it's
happen not to like them,
legitimate.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly. So right now, the villain, as far as corruption goes, is Kenya.
Yeah.
And the former kind of golden boy is not quite any longer, as in the case of Uganda. It changes according to politics and according to what, in this case, the British Foreign Office is concerned with. And we need to step back from that and look at it from the vantage point of people who live in these countries. If they have governments they dislike, there's no better solution than the one that they can provide.
Yeah.
And you can never export democracy from the West. And the very act of trying to do so, in fact, is counterproductive and undermines democratic institutions and undermines accountability. And so it has a politically corrupting influence. So I would, draw on these points and talk about how narrow these examples are of corruption and how meaningless they are, really.
A lot of the issues that they were touching on was things like the reasons why Africa can't develop really is because of corruption, even in speaking to some of our friends. So I don't know, is that something that you've found to happen as well?
Absolutely, yes. It's not a case of either you have corruption and less development, or you don't and a decent level of development. There isn't really a direct correlation between the two.
Yeah.
And to focus on corruption is really to suggest that there's an internal problem within Africa that is the reason for its lack of development. It's not about its links with the world economy, it's not about its relationship with the more developed world. And I believe that's wrong, and that's where we should look to see where these real problems are that are barriers to development.
I'm thinking to myself, why is corruption suddenly become the focus area for, as an excuse or something that people are pointing towards to? Do you know what I mean?
I think I do. I think one attraction for the donor community is that it evades the issue of their accountability. And so in effect, we could ask, what is Western development policy, what effect has that had on development in African countries? And are we not displacing that by looking at the question of corruption?
So why the preoccupation with corruption in Africa?
I think it reflects a collapse of wider political vision. And when you think of the whole anti-colonial movement in Africa and the heat around third world development, there were a lot of exciting competing visions of the future. And those have gone, and I think when you have the broader picture melting away, you then become a lot more narrowly focused, and you look upon things that deal much more with your immediate experience or your family's experience and not much beyond that. And so you tend to generalize much more from too little that's of meaning. And I'd like to see, well, where are the big ideas now in Africa? Where is the Pan-African Highway? Where's the Pan-African Railway? Where are the major hydroelectric projects? There are a few, but where's the excitement around them? Where's the sense that these problems could be addressed, that a milestone of development could quite easily be reached with the existing levels of technology that we have, with the skills and know-how that are already in place?
It's just such pessimism, and I know, coming from South Africa, being there, my friends, my family, the success stories, explaining to people about the beauty and the positivity, and even traveling around Africa, the things that I've seen, like community spirit and people's hopes and dreams and the energy that's there, that's something that I miss, and that's something that I want people to get excited about when they sit and they think about Africa. That's my vision personally, and this show, I think, is probably the first step towards many things. I think if I can just show people what else is going on, that you have to start sitting back, listening more, thinking differently, start questioning why are people saying that? What does it mean? Is it really true? Is it really true that all Africans are corrupt?
Up my pager, who rap, track, whack, and who flows full of